Mishpatim in the year Tafshin Yudal 1954. Let me bring up the page. Hold on. There we go. Okay, so this is an Avadim Maamar, like all the Maamarim of Mishpatim are, and it's on the idea of the different levels of the Avadim, different levels of servants and service of Avodas Hashem that's represented in the different types of servants that we learn about in this week's parsha and opening this week's parsha, and the connection to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Torah says like this: the pasuk says, "Ve'ela Mishpatim." These are the Mishpatim, which are the judgments or the mitzvahs. Is an idea, is a name from mitzvahs. Asher Tasim, you should place the name before the Jewish people. As the pasuk continues to explain, it explains the laws of kisikna eved. If you're going to acquire for yourself a Hebrew slave, means a slave from the Jewish people, gomer, etc. And then it says, the pasuk continues in the subject further. It says, and what about if a person were to sell his own daughter as a maid servant, gomer? And then we have the laws, what about if you were to strike your servant or your maid servant with a shevet as a stick? Which the Rebbe says, we're talking about in these verses, in the subject of the laws of slavery, that there's the slave, which is called the Hebrew slave, which is the Jewish slave. There's the laws of the Amah of the maid servant, of the female slave, Jewish as well. And then there's the Evet Kanani, the Gentile slave, the Kanani slave. But in this level, we don't talk on the fourth level, which is the Shivcha Kananis, which is the maid servant, the Gentile maid servant, the Kanani maid servant. And then there's the Bas, the daughter, that gets sold as the slave. There it says like this. The Vadzois, okay, the whole idea is again, this is an Avadim Maamar. So the Vadzois, we know that there's a rule, whatever there is in the revealed Torah, there's obviously in the hidden parts of Torah. I know we say the Hishtashlis, the Mela means that the way things are above in the chain of creation. That way it's here it manifests in the laws of actually the slaves, but it represents a higher level of avoda in the hidden worlds. And therefore, it's not just something that remains in the higher world, but there's a connection that we have in our avoda here in this world that is represented by what is the meaning of this whole idea of slavery and the different levels of slaves in higher worlds. And therefore, we can apply it to our own life, even if you're actually not a person who's a slave, but it represents the different types of Avodas Hashem, service of God. We know that the idea of serving God, like it says in this week's parsha, is Avadim Hashem Lakechem, you should serve. And we use the word Avodah, which is serve, and it comes from the word Ibud Iris, beating the hides, as we want to learn in this manner. The mitzvahs really are in Avodas Hashem, which are dependent in time. There's certain mitzvahs that are only dependent in time, like the mitzvah of the Hebrew slave. The only time it was halachically allowed for a person to own a Jewish slave was in the times of the Jubilee, which was only pretty much in the first temple. And after that, when there was no proper Jubilee, even in the second temple, wasn't a proper Jubilee, there was no such thing as having Jewish slaves. Therefore, these mitzvahs that today and for a good part of our history, they were not practical because it only is as long as the Jubilee is here. It means to say that specifically these mitzvahs, they drop off with time, and that time is a long period of time. The meaning to say is that primarily they represent their avodah ruchnis, their spiritual avodah. Because Torah itself is everlasting. It has to be applicable to all times and places. So if it doesn't manifest in a physical sense, then its spiritual idea is more emphasized in how we learn and apply to Avodas Hashem. And because these mitzvahs, like the mitzvahs of slavery, are dependent on times, and it's only if the time of the Yovel is around, which is again basically the first 800 years of the Jewish people, the years of the judges and the years of the kings and the prophets, and after the destruction of the first temple, no longer was it applicable in the physical sense. So we must say that the primary message is in the spiritual. We must say, spiritually, and as they express themselves in the spiritual sense, they're everlasting, and therefore there's something that we can take from it today. So a person may say, what's the idea of an avid, of the laws of slavery mean to me today if it's not applicable today? Yes, the physical idea of having a slave is not applicable today. But of course, this idea of the spiritual message and how it affects our Avodas Hashem day to day, and how we're going to see in this Maamar, and this applies, we see this in many of the Maamarim that are discussed that are studied on in Parshas Mishpatim. And the way they are spiritually, they're everlasting. We find this in the memory of the Alter Rebbe. We find the explanation of Kol B'chinas the Eved Ivri V'Ami Ivri V'Eved Knani. We find how the Alter Rebbe explains the different levels of the Hebrew slave, the Hebrew maidservant, and the Gentile slave. How they are in the spiritual, and how we apply it as individuals, but other than our own lives. What's the idea? Rabbis have taught us that the soul of a person has 5 various names, and the names represent different levels and punctualities of the soul within the soul. Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechid. The lowest level is Nefesh. There's the Ruach, the spirit, the Neshama, the Chai, and the Yechida. The highest level, the 5th level is the Yechida, the lowest level is the Nefesh. And the Chamesh Shemus Elohim Kinegedal Elohim is Abiyah. And these 4 names of the soul represent different manifestations of the soul, and they correspond to the four worlds of Atzilus, which is emanation, which is before Bria creation, which means it's one with God. Like the parts of the soul that it represents, Bria creation, Yitzira formation, Astis action, which is the element of Nefesh, the element of the Nefesh, which is the lowest level. So that we have 4 worlds and 5 levels of the soul. So he says, Chai Yechida, the 2 external levels of the soul, as we know many times. Chai Yechida is the level of the soul that's makif. It doesn't come with pnimis, it doesn't internalize. So the level of Chai Yechida of the soul, the Zohar actually coins them as a single level called the soul of the soul, like an external of the soul, although technically they're broken down into 2 parts, Chai Yechida. In Chassidus, in the Hebrew Maamar Chassidus, it explains that fundamentally the Yechida's Chai is alive, Yechida is one. The oneness of the soul is actually very different than the Chai of the soul, but they're in the same category. The difference is fundamentally there's no counter to it. Where we talk about that there's even a level of Chai, of Makif, of external, of levels of impurity or the levels of the Nefesh Bahamis. There's nothing that's on the other side, meaning the side of impurity, that corresponds to the level of the Yechida, of the oneness, because the Yechida is only one. There's only one, like there's only one God. There's no correspondence to the essence of God. There's manifestations of levels that can express itself in negative, that gives off yeshus, that is something separate from God. An impression of separate from God. There's nothing that corresponds to the essence of God. But there's a force of evil that corresponds to the essence of God. The essence is only one. There's only Yachid, Hashem Echad. So to the Neshama, there's no counter to the Yechida of the soul, of the godly soul. But in general, we categorize them in one level, which is the level of Atzilus, which Chai Yechida is the external of the soul, just like the world of Atzilus is it's beyond the world of separation. In general, it's the oneness of the world of Atzilus. God means that his light and his vessels are one in the world of Atzilus. You don't see that there's a separation. In general, that represents the 2 levels of the higher levels of external of the soul, which is Chai Yechida. And those levels of the soul are constantly conscious of the performance and the actions of the internal parts of the soul, which is Nefesh, Ruach, and Neshama, and it feels the pain. When the godly soul is in pain, is because the godly soul feels what's happening to it, but is almost helpless. Besides to trigger like signals of godliness. Like we've learned many times that the idea that person gets feelings of tshuva, repentance, of return is because the outside, the external of the soul is signaling your consciousness to wake up and to be chayzer b'tshuva, to return to Hashem. So that's the way and the level of Chai Yechida, which is like the Zohar says, the Neshama of the Neshama, corresponds to Atzilus. So we have the group of Chai Yechida as one, and then we have Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, which are the worlds of Asiya, Yitzira, and Bria, going from the bottom up. So he says, is in Bechina Zuhu connect the Matzilus. We give no Bechinas Nefesh Ruach Neshama and connect the Gimel Elements Bia B'Yitziyasiyah. Is the worlds have to coexist with each other. He's Hine Gam Mish Nishmasim Bechinas Nefesh Ta'atiluvad. The person consciousness and functionality of the soul is only coming from the level of Nefesh, which means from the world of Asiya. Which means you have very little of so to say, the inner parts of your soul being alive and functioning within you. It's there, but it's not conscious. Because it's the skalus, it's clear by God, called Sharma Drakes and up. It means the nefesh has within it, but it's being concealed and hidden in the deeper parts of the soul. It has 5 names because they're all connected and you can't separate. In Chassidus, sometimes it talks about the idea of karas is maybe where there is a kind of a separation between the levels of the soul. The whole of karas means when there's a punishment of being disconnected. So the Yechai Pida never gets disconnected. So when you say that the concept of disconnect, it possibly could be referring to within the 5 levels of the soul. He said, therefore he says, is Shidar Sha'amach Shemus Nikolai has 5 names. The whole Neshama Neshama for each person. Okay, and because there's 4 levels of the soul and every person has it, so every person could really tap into 4 expressions of the soul, 4 groups. The Chayachid is 1 group, and then we have the Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh. And the different levels of slavery represent the different levels of relationship and consciousness and service of within the soul itself. We have the Dal B'chinas of Evet Pinani, Evet Ivri, Ivriya Ovas. So the lowest level is the Kanani slave, and then goes the Hebrew slave, then goes the Hebrew maidservant, female, and then there's the Bas, the daughter. The daughter is, she's a daughter. That same daughter could become Amma Havriya. That means when do we talk about the daughter? We talk about the daughter in this week's parasha is because the father who sells the daughter, but there's the daughter, and then as she's sold. So there's as she is a daughter, and there's as she is Amma Havriya when she becomes a maidservant. If someone sells his daughter, and she's his daughter, and then once she's sold, then she becomes an Amma Havriya. She becomes a maidservant. But also the Malka, what are we talking about the daughter? She's the daughter of the queen, of the king. Which is, we're going to see, represents the Chai Yechida. And each one has a different relationship with the master or the father. So too, each one of the souls, levels of the souls have a different relationship. And when you're functioning on that level is how you function. Means if you're only functioning as an Evet Kanani, so that's your reality. Your reality is a Kanani slave. If you're able to elevate and refine yourself to the consciousness and level of the daughter, which is even before she's sold as a maidservant, so then you're holding a level of spiritual service that's on the level of the daughter. And what that means, like he says, Avadim, the daughter of the queen. Shmadregas Bas, Avadim, the level of the daughter, the queen, and the king, he becomes Chai Yechida. He starts, that's the highest level, which is in the world of Atzilus, which is all one. Begin Madregas Evet Kanani, Evet Ivri, Amma Ivriya. The 3 levels of the Kanani slave, the lowest, and then comes the Hebrew slave, and then on top of that is the maid slave. They correspond to the Nefesh Ruach and Neshama that we said. It corresponds to the world of Asiya Yitzira Bria. What is the difference? Evet Kanani, the Kanani slave, he's first setting up the levels, and then he's going to explain what are those levels of Avodah. The Evet Kanani who Bechinas Nefesh Asiya, that's the level of the Nefesh, which is the lowest consciousness of the soul, which is the world of the sea of action. Evet Ivri, the Hebrew slave, is the level of the soul called the Ruach, the spirit, which is in the world of Yisir, formation. things are much less megusham, and we'll see what that means in a person's understanding and commitment to Torah mitzvahs, and especially Avodas Hashem. The honor Ivriya, the maidservant, Kivichnis Neshama, is the highest level of the three levels, which is in the world of Bria creation. Just like we have these three levels in the soul, it's had this chak because each one corresponds to another world. So too the angels in these worlds are either like a Canaanite slave, a Hebrew slave, or an Ivriya, or the maidservant. Because the angels, each one brings flow into their world, so they correspond to that one. They also have these differences, like we found in here. The Rebbe is putting them into three general categories. The Rambam discusses the 10 levels of spirits or angels, Avadim, etc. Ishim. He's had these chalkus sh'baylos, how they're separated in each world. For instance, Malach Sandel, he's known as Malach Sandel, who became as Evet Kanani Shvasiya. He's the spiritual level of a Kanani servant. In Avoda, he's an angel, but he's not an angel. Like again, the Rambam writes, when you open up the first few chapters of the Rambam, discusses that when we talk about the angel revealed himself, etc., these are low level of angels. When you talk about the Srafim, the Chayes, the Kodesh is the highest level. These are much higher. These are even higher, possibly than Machal Gabriel, higher than your average angels. So Sandal, which is in the world of Asiya, is like the Kanani slave. Matat, we write, it's brought down the Matat is Sarapnim. Right? We have the famous story of the Baal Shem Tov, who has the note that says from Matat, Sukan Sisha Val Yisrael Baal Shem Tov Kosheru. So the angel Matat signed Sarapnim. Where does he reside? He's in the world of Yitzira. And that's Evet Ivri. There's angels in the higher worlds. When you keep in Shetach, Sivitz, and Shalamata, he avoided the koine, and because our avoid in this world, the reason why soul becomes united with the body, and when it comes to united with the body, that is the you, is command was Aramino, Leinivrasi, El Neshamish, is koine. I have only my own reason why I'm created is to serve my master. That's the elevation you want to reach to be a servant. Well, now, if the service is to have this aliyah, elevation in this world, that we come down to this world, this Yerudah Tzarech aliyah, how do we have this aliyah? When we interact in the three pillars of service, which is represented by Torah, Avodah, and Mitzvah Sadim. Torah study, Avodah, which is primarily tefillah, prayer, and Mitzvah Sadim, acts of kindness, which represent most of the mitzvahs. Therefore, each one, and the Rebbe is going to explain the Maamar, our avodah of Torah, and in our avodah tefillah, and in our avodah of Chasadim and the mitzvahs, they're also broken up into these four categories of Bas, Ivriya, Evet Ivri, and Evet Kanani. Okay, let's go further. So the idea is like this. Okay, so we kind of set the chart of what everything is. We have four levels of service, which is the Canaanite slave, the Hebrew slave, the maidservant, who's a Jewish slave, and there's the daughter. We're not talking about the Shifcha Canaanis. We'll put her in the category, the female with the Evet Kanani. Although we're going to see the differences that they have different avodas. And then we have the four worlds, which is Atzilus, Bri, Yitzia, and each one represent different types of service. And the Torah tells us the four categories that Hayachida, which is the world of Atzilus, and there's Neshama, Ruach, and Nefesh, which represent Bri, Yitzia, and they all go together with Avodah. Each one represents the Avodah of the different type of servant. And each one of those different types of services are in each Torah mitzvahs, Torah, Avodah, and Chasadim. Okay, so now we have to put it all together. First, understand what are these different avodas and how it apply to our Torah study, how it apply, how we differentiate the different levels of our davening, of our tefillah, and of our chasadim, of our acts of kindness, which are primarily the mitzvahs. To explain all this, what is the Evet Kanani? What is the character and the functionality? How does the Evet Kanani function? Is to look at, analyze the physical slave. The Eved Kanani has zero interest in being a slave. The Gemara says that Eved Kanani, or it's rather an Eved Behefkeru Nichle, the Eved wants to be free. But because he's been sold into slavery and he has the master, he's forced to serve the master. He has no desire to serve the master. A slave wants to be free. An Eved Behefkeru Nichle, he wants to be free. But he has no choice, he's forced to serve the master. It's not made. He doesn't want to be a person who accepts the yoke. I don't want to listen. I don't want to be free. And he doesn't want to do service. His wants reflect, and only able to be really actualized if he would be free. Which is the opposite of accepting the yoke to accept your master. So why doesn't he rebel? He's scared of the stick. A person who strikes his servant or his maidservant with the stick. So the reason he doesn't rebel is because he's scared of the stick. Even if he doesn't actually hit him. The fact that the stick exists. And if he chooses to, he can hit him. It makes him work, knowing that there's consequences if he doesn't. It's not just the actual hitting, he's getting hit, and therefore he listens. And the only fact that there's an idea of the stick, and you know that it exists, and if the master so chooses, he can use it, that is enough for it to be effective. So that's called a makiv war, right? Because nothing happened to you. But it's the fact that it exists that has effect on you. Okay, so it seems that we're talking rough ideas about service, that we have to apply this to our Avodas Hashem, our service to God. The whole thing is they're scared of the stick. What does this mean? This means that he has absolutely no pleasure and no will to serve. And he has no intellect or feeling in the heart in the service. He's dry. Yeah, you see a person who sometimes in service is Maamar, you can tell he hates every minute that he's there. He's only scared of the stick. So what is the Kanani slave in Ruchnis? A person that is wants to be free, and there's the Yiras Hashem is the fear of the stick, not even the being hit by the stick, but the potential of being hit by the stick. This means a person who has absolutely no pleasure in serving God. So why does he serve God? He's scared. He's scared God's going to hit him with the stick. God's going to strike him with illness, with poverty, with unhappiness, with consequences. And he says not just the actual years einish, but also the spiritual effect, that you're only literally functioning because there's these cruises, these calls that says do tshuva. Means what's the talk of you? The subconscious of that pulling you. You have no feeling, you're not interested really. It was not good for actually the rest of the person can live their whole life. That this idea of fear of the spiritual stick is why you wake up in the morning and why you net watch Megawas, why you put on, why you have control, why you send your kids to Jewish education, why you make Shabbos, why you have a shir, why do you go to Daf Yomi, why do you do Rabbam? It's only years of Shabbat. Shalei over a very young, the rest is even deeper. Technically, on paper, you could be a tzaddik. You never do an aver because you're scared of the consequences. It's safe to say you'll never sin. Technically, you can even make it to the Bainani. You're still not Kanani. You're totally guided by fear of the stick. So on paper, you're actually Bainani of Tanya. You've never sinned, you won't sin, you don't think thoughts of sin, you don't act, you don't speak acts of thought, you don't hate for God, all the deep, difficult description of a Bainani, you can still be an Abbot Kanani. A person who's really wants to be free, you're scared of the consequences. The Rebbe says you can be a person. And not only are you careful what you speak or do, but even what you think. You can't stop a thought popping in your mind. But if you dwell, you mahara baros, and you willingly contemplate the thing that's forbidden, again, it doesn't have to be something coarse or even something that you would be ashamed to agree to, even a slight level of jealousy or desire for covet, and you dwell on it. The fact that you feel a pain of jealousy that strikes you, that's natural. But if you push it out and don't dwell on it, don't allow it to take hold of you. Once you do that, then you're a Russia. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, the Benini is careful with his thoughts as well. And because of that, he also controls himself or herself, not to be sunken into giving into your pleasures. We're not just talking about doing pleasures that are forbidden, even the permissible. Why? Because as a good Jew, and he's scared of the Shevet, he's scared of the consequences. That the Tanya says, like he quotes from the Ramban, according to the opinion of the Charedim, to sanctify yourself into permissible, meaning not to be soaked even into permissible pleasures. Each one knows according to themselves what that could be, on what level that you could be. Not that we all know that there's different things that are pleasurable, but the question is, what are the things that you're struggling with, even if it's permissible? Even kind of any mushuk with tithes. So if the Torah says, and to be a Beinoni, you have to fulfill all the mitzvahs, including Kaddish, Asbach, B'Mutulach. So the Beinoni doesn't even indulge in pleasures. You won't dwell on anything forbidden, and part of the forbidden is even the sanctification in the permissible. And then because otherwise he'd be over an Avera, and then he won't be Beinoni. And the Shekol Zeh Hu Mitzad Yiras Hashem. So the person who literally is on paper is Machmish Tzaddik, a Beinoni for sure. But the problem is everything about that person, he or she, is just because scared of the spiritual stick. It doesn't just mean that God's going to strike you with the illness. Like he says before, it's just you have no interest. But you know you have to be connected. Technically, you'd love to do an affair, possibly. Therefore, you're called a Kenani slave. Because the only thing that keeps you in line is the fear of the stick. You would want to be free. And my Maamar explains that this is a very high level, because a person that's struggling with that is mamish on the front lines of Avodah, because the only thing that's keeping you really is Hashem. What is it? Not because you want to be connected to Hashem or the high levels. It's your Irish. It's the stick. But mamish, that's where there's a lot of the Maamar we praise the Evet Canaan. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's a metzius, it's a fact. It's not refined, it's a growth. But it's a madrega, it's a level of avodah. The Rebbe says this that we're describing, that there's a servant, a Kanani servant, that's the level of Beini, who never does anything wrong, is the perfect Kanani servant. Like Rabban Gamliel talks about his righteous Ebed Kanani, even about his, my servant TV Avdi Kosher. Ain't TV Avdi. I'm sorry, my servant TV is not Kishar Kol Avadim Kosher. You like the other servants who do other things wrong. He's a kosher, he's good, he's qualified. And therefore, Rabbi Gamliel did things that even the Gemara says you shouldn't do for a servant. Because he says he's not a regular servant, he's on the highest level, but he's still not the commandment. It's machlekes if he was Megayer, if he converted or not. There's a level of Evet Kanani that you're not like on a high level. She's very Madreg Russia, that's the Russia. Meaning to say, you try to get away with things. Was that goofy? Madreg is a chaluk, like the Tanya says, there's many levels. Madreg is analysis of Russia, but if you only that very rackle upon the like the Tanya says, the person who does things bad very rarely, only one of the three categories of machshav div of thought, speed, and action. Not only not in something harsh, but something light, but still not A drop of like jealousy, a drop of covet, a drop of something inappropriate. Behind which years Hashevet anything else is like the persons can't be totally controlled by the stick. But you think you could possibly get away with a few things. For instance, you never do anything, say anything, maybe think something. It didn't penetrate the stick to control the person's thoughts. Sometimes you'll think of something, maybe not even a severe thought, but a light thought, but still not very. That's one of them. There's a little. Sometimes affects his speech and his reaction. Once again, the fear of the stick is not just that you can get punished, but it's the feelings of tshuva that hit you and say, what's going on? What are you doing? It's the cruising, it's the cause that say, do tshuva, and you connect to that. In special moments, you feel, I shouldn't be behaving this way. Do proper tshuva. Take off your sin and your blemishes and find atonement. You're still not, you've cleansed yourself, but you're still, tomorrow it's not, we're not sure. Then you will never do an affair like the Tanya says. You have feelings of repentance, but you don't act on it. You don't do proper repentance. That's like a person is the good is very literally functioning in the person. It's so small that you can't even do proper tshuva. You have feelings of tshuva, you don't complete the tshuva. But still you have good in you. You have a little bit of good, and it only affects that you have feelings that you would like to do tshuva, but you're not able to do the full tshuva. As a tanikr, it has an effect. At least you have regrets, even if you don't do proper tshuva. This is like it's quoted from the result, and the Baal Shem Tov quotes this many times. What does it mean that the wicked are full of regrets? Because you're constantly regretting. You want to be closer. You're regretting your situation. A person who is so disobedient that there is no effect on you. And therefore, the call of tshuva is not going to affect you. Sometimes Hashem situations has to hit you with a physical stick. Sometimes it's the pain that person goes through. That's like and it's a deep Avadim. This is sometimes where a person where the good is so little that the only thing you will respond to is God gives you an actual slap. Just that you have spirit, you're lacking spiritually is not going to affect you. It has to hit home physically. It has to give you actually serve. We found the king Menashe, the king of Yehuda, who was the son of Chizkiyahu, who was a big Ovid, who was a Ritzayach and a Ovid of Avodas. But when he was taken and tremendously tortured by the Babylonians in copper pots, burned alive, he returned to God, not only because he had Yisurim, he had physical pain. There's a person who doesn't get affected by tshuva. I don't like to finish in the middle of a ice. We'll finish over here by another level deeper in the Evet Kanani. So we should be able to get through. This is a 10, 11 page Maamar. We should hopefully try to get through it. Today's Monday. Get through it by the end of the week. Today again, it's Shvat. The Rebbe is Tzortzet. We're naming her honor. They have Kashus. They have connections to the Rebbe and the which is the number value of 22. And every time I have all the blessings of Tevanir Vanilla, any Shevet, only Tach. Have a wonderful rest of your day.